Here at the Historical Society, we have many records of the Puritans whose documents show a great interest in biblical studies and ancient historical Judaism and its legacy and early text. But we have very little about the encounters with the Jewish people who were their contemporaries. What were their interest in and attitude towards the Jews as a people? We have known very little about this. Michael Hoberman spent a year here at the Society as an NEH long-term fellow. And much of the research that you're going to hear tonight went into his book he did between 2008 and 2009. Tonight he'll talk about the book that came from that research, New England, New Israel, Jews and Puritans in Early America, which was recently published by the University of Massachusetts Press. Michael's an associate professor at the at the Fitchburg State University, and there he's a professor of English and folklore. He's the author of How Strange It Seems, The Cultural Life of Jews in Small-Town New England, which was published in 2008. And he's a resident of Buckland, which is out there someplace. So he knows a lot, speaking as a Bostonian, so he knows a lot about small-town New England. So I'm delighted that he's back here east in Boston, and we welcome him tonight to discuss his new book.
Thanks very much, Dennis, and I'm very gratified to be here. I'm very gratified that you're here and that you weathered, well, the storm is not, you haven't seen Buckland proportions of snow yet, but neither have we this winter, so we're all doing fine. Anyway, I'm very glad to be here. As Dennis said, much of the research I did for the book, I did while I was here as a long-term fellow using archives that I found here. And for that matter, the time that it was afforded me away from my typical very heavy teaching responsibilities, the time that was afforded me by the fellowship made this book possible. This book, I would not have written this book had it not been for the generosity of the MHS and the NEH that made this, offered me this grant a few years ago. Well, my starting point, I will be talking about the book itself and the findings, the archival materials that I used, but my starting point for this talk is actually an article from the New York Times from about 2 months ago. I don't usually read the dining section of the New York Times because I'm more interested in eating than in reading about eating. But there happened to be an article, I was in an airport for a long time, and so I read every portion of that paper. There was an article that day, this was just before Hanukkah, and there was an article about an annual event that occurs in the White House, which involves the hiring of basically a council of Orthodox rabbis who are brought to the White House every year. And according to the article, this goes back into the at least the early Clinton years, maybe earlier. Every year, the White House kitchen is koshered or kashered in order to accommodate a very big Hanukkah party. The Clintons did it, the Bushes did it, and now President Obama, whose brother-in-law, by the way, as you may know, is a rabbi himself, President Obama hosts a Hanukkah party as well. And why I thought this was relevant is that I guess as I was reading this article, it gave me pause to think, well, how did it ever happen in that some 200 plus years after the founding of this republic, that the White House actually hosts an annual Hanukkah party, and for that matter, how did it happen that they pay, I assume, quite a bit of money every year to hire this Orthodox rabbi to do this work of ensuring the kosher status of the kitchen? How did this occur? And for that matter, would the founding fathers, and I don't mean just the founding political fathers, but really the founding fathers of American Protestantism, would they have imagined that some 200 plus years later such a thing would be happening? I don't have an answer to that question, but I find it a remarkable thing all the same that it did happen. Now, for that matter, the election of a black man to the office of president was probably another thing that they couldn't have imagined. And for my part, I don't think I could have imagined that 10, 15 years ago myself. Be that as it may, leaving aside the issue of racial barriers having been broken, the evolution of an ecumenical or at least a Judeo-Christian, that's a phrase we so often hear in political discourse, the evolution of this Judeo-Christian mindset in the United States, even if its primary manifestations sometimes seem fairly superficial, which to me sometimes they do, all of the scope of possibilities for happy Christmas and happy Hanukkah and happy Kwanzaa, is that really ecumenicism? But in any case, I find that the fact that we've achieved this is a remarkable thing. I don't want, and my book I think is trying to avoid oversimplifying and minimizing the complexity that underlies this American ecumenicism. But in any case, I find that it's worthy of serious attention. And the book that I wrote and that was published recently that I'm talking about this evening, threw close attention to several episodes in 17th and 18th century American religious history, particularly in New England, in this part of America, attempts to explore the interconnections between Christian and Jewish thought in the years preceding the creation of the American Republic. I have an introductory chapter that describes sort of some contextual events in the Netherlands and in England in the, let's say, the early to mid 17th century. But the book's primary chapters focus on the mid 17th to late 18th centuries in New England. That's the historical scope for the book. Now, I'm hesitant to generalize too widely from events that occurred 200 and 300 years ago. So I'll be the first to admit that whatever these events and patterns during the colonial era about which I've written, they're not necessarily the direct precursors to these White House Hanukkah parties. But I'd like to begin answering the question that I put a little while ago. What did the Protestant founding fathers do that would help ensure, even if only inadvertently, that 200 years after the founding, Judaism would thrive, at least as a religious practice, in the United States? Now, I'll start out by suggesting two primary possibilities, one of which I'll give sort of lip service to, and the other of which is really what the book is about. So the first, the lip service pretext or idea here is that the early Protestant founding fathers or Puritan fathers, whatever we want to call them, they themselves felt and stoked in others a deathly fear of Catholics. For me, that's a very significant factor here. And in a moment, I'll try to explain why this, to borrow a very common phrase, why this fear of Catholics, at least temporarily, was good for the Jews. But it was in colonial America. It was very good for the Jews. The second point, which is really what this book talks about, is that for early American Protestants, even though they didn't love or necessarily even like Jews, they talked a lot, argued a lot, were fascinated so much by Jews, Jewish history, and Judaism. And that's really what this book discusses. Now, very quickly, the lip service part about the fear of Catholics. Pauline Mayer was giving a seminar here, or she was participating in one, and she said that, I wish I had written down her exact words, but she said something like, you could never overestimate the fear, how important the fear of Catholicism was as a guide of events in early America, particularly in New England. And so even though, particularly for Jews, right, Jews, not only are they not Catholics, right, and for that matter, they're not Quakers, and they're not members of potentially rival Protestant sects, but the Jews who came to colonial America, by and large, were Sephardim in the earliest period of settlement, and so they were the people who had been tortured by Catholics. They had that going for them. They also spoke Spanish, and this was significant too because they could be counted upon by British English authorities and for that matter other non-Jewish merchants in the colonies. They could be counted upon, first of all, to be loyal to the English crown, and second, they could finagle fairly expedient trade partnerships with Spanish and Portuguese connections because they had that linguistic facility and they also had family connections. These Sephardim were primarily Marranos. In other words, they were many of them were the extraction of so-called new Jews or hidden Jews. So many of them still had family members who were hidden their Judaism was hidden, that is, in Spain and Portugal. So they were useful allies to have. That explains, I think, at least why Sephardic merchants were as successful as they were within the British colonial sphere, not just in North America, but throughout the Atlantic world. Now, the second principle I mentioned is more important for the book, and that is that American Protestants have always been fascinated by Jews and by Judaism. In early America, their interest in Jews was itself an internally destabilizing force, and it helped to produce such an outpouring of argumentative discourse among American Protestants, Puritans, that it contributed inadvertently to the new nation's eventual adoption of something that we call religious freedom. The fascination I'm referring to here often functioned as a bellwether of internal, specifically Protestant dilemmas and crises. And I'll name three of those dilemmas because they come up and they're the lens through which I interpret the interactions between Puritans and Sephardic Jews. One is the dilemma posed by the opposing forces within Puritanism, a drive to honor the importance of individual piety, and for that matter, the importance of the individual conscience versus the necessity to maintain communal order. This was a dilemma that every generation of Puritans faced. Their theology was eternally conflicted about this, and their discourse about Jews, what I argue in the book, helped them to sort out what they thought about that, how to deal with that dilemma. Another dilemma, again, within Puritanism, a sense of two opposing forces, the connection or the necessity of honoring covenantal precedents, which for many Puritans really could be traced back to Judaism itself. Judaism for Puritans was all about covenantal precedents, right? What the commandments are, the law itself, versus a belief in and an upholding of an idea of divine grace. So these another set of opposing forces, and then finally the drive to honor and practice some form of religious orthodoxy within Puritanism was often subject to pressure because of Puritans' need and interest in and motivation to make money. So these three sets of sort of what I would call internal crises are very heavily informed by, or they're alleviated, they're sorted through by Puritan discourse about Jews. That's basically what the book is trying to do. And in a moment, I'll get into some of the specifics about that. When Puritans disagreed about Jews or about Judaism, which they did about as often as they disagreed about the exact implications of communion, or about baptism, or about whether it was best to convert Indians or kill them. In other words, when they disagreed the way they typically disagreed about all kinds of things, Puritans disagree the way Jews disagree. It's a common thread here. When they were struggling with these dilemmas, they were revealing their deepest misgivings about the dilemmas posed by their errand in the wilderness. Their endless debates over these misgivings eventually instilled in them a fear of any one Protestant sect gaining the upper hand, and this in turn nudged them in the direction of a sort of acquiescence. In order to prevent the predominance of one sect, they decided that they had to practice what was in their time a fairly unprecedented sort of religious tolerance. So it was an inadvertent move in the direction of religious tolerance. Now, just a very brief digression to bring it back into present times before I really go back and get into the archives. I was thinking about sort of present-day manifestations of, how does this split within Protestantism, how do we see it today? And I think you don't have to look much farther than Michigan and Arizona to see how this sort of thing plays out. I was just thinking, for instance, here, whether or not Protestants literally really care about Jews a lot, they certainly argue and talk a lot about Israel. And the position that a given American Protestant takes on the question, the Israeli-Palestinian-Iranian situation, very often is an index of their beliefs on all kinds of other things. In other words, a Protestant, I'm sorry for generalizing here, but Protestant sects that are, let's say, sympathetic to all manner of social issues like gay rights and so on are probably going to be more tolerant and open to the idea of a two-state solution. And if fundamentalist Protestants who are very strong in their support of Israel and sort of intransigent on that will very typically be on the other side of that issue. So it has this split within Protestantism has not disappeared. It's morphed into something very different. Okay, now back to the safe arena of history. Okay. So the underlying context that creates the situations that I write about in the book really develops in England and in the Netherlands, and it starts. Well, in the 16th century, my book really doesn't begin talking about events until the first part of the 17th century. And in particular, I talk about, there's a phenomenon that I discuss in the book, which the phrase I use for it, I borrow other historians' use of this phrase, Puritan hebraism. Okay, there's a long tradition within Puritanism of fascination with Jews and Judaism, and for that matter, with the Hebrew language, Hebrew grammar, and so on and so forth. So the basis for what later develops in North America is created specifically in some cases with actual interactions that took place in the Netherlands, for instance, and in England between Puritan ministers and Sephardic Jews. There was one instance, I think it was in the 1620s, where there was actually a staged debate. It wasn't in Amsterdam, it might have been in Leiden, in some city in the Netherlands, between a Jewish rabbi, David Farrar, and I'm sorry, I don't remember at the moment the name of the Protestant minister. These two, Hugh Broughton, he was a very well-known Puritan Hebraicist. These two men sort of had at it, had an open debate about, of course, what else? The divinity of Christ. I don't know who won the debate. There hasn't really been. All we know is that the debate took place, and that, in and of itself, I think is remarkable, that at least in the Netherlands, there was a sufficiently tolerant context that you could actually set something like this up. Eventually, now most of these people don't budge from where they are physically, but a few, as we know, a few of these English Puritans in particular, some of them having passed through the Netherlands, as you know, some of them make their way to New England, to Boston, to eastern Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and so forth. And that's really what this book talks about. I'm not going to talk about every chapter in the book. The opening substantive chapter of the book talks about, I refer back to a little bit of what Dennis was saying, that this fascination on the part of New England Puritans, even when there were no Jews around, with Jewish precedents. What you're looking at here is a hand-copied version of John Cotton, the early Massachusetts minister, his draft proposal of laws for Massachusetts. Now, Cotton was overruled. This proposal was not actually put into practice because I think it was Nathaniel Ward's Body of Liberties that was adopted in its place. But the reason I've reproduced this slide, and it's in the book as well, is if you look, you'll see there are little margin notes indicated on the side. And what they do is they suggest a precedent in the book of Deuteronomy. So these are laws that are proposed for Massachusetts, and then Cotton, or the person who copied Cotton's draft, then indicates chapter and verse from Deuteronomy. Basically, almost every single law in this proposal that Cotton put forth was based on a law in the Jewish Bible. The first part of my book talks about things like that. Basically, the mid-17th century debates within Massachusetts Bay over whether Jewish law or an interpretation of Jewish law was an appropriate way to rule Massachusetts. And in the end, it was more of a compromise between Jewish law, ancient Jewish law, and sort of modern English law was adopted. But there were people who wanted to have their way, among them John Cotton, to just basically take chapter and verse from Deuteronomy, including laws that that breaking the Sabbath would be a capital offense, that sort of thing. Once you get to the latter decades of the 17th century, then you begin to see actual Jews present. And that's when the story, for me anyway, becomes a little bit more interesting. So I want to tell one of those stories. The first Jew to come to Massachusetts Bay was Solomon Franco, and he was only here for 3 months. He came here in 1649. Basically, he was a supercargo on a ship that was traveling from the Netherlands, dropping off cargo here, and he was let off here because he was in charge of the cargo, and then when he got here, nobody was willing to pay him for the work that he had done. So the Massachusetts authorities allowed him to stay here. They actually put him up for 3 months. They said they fed and housed him for 3 months and told him as soon as the next ship for Holland came that he was supposed to go back there. And so that's what happens with him. And there are a few other sort of very itinerant Jewish presences here. But in 1695, 2 brothers of Sephardic background, Samuel and Joseph Frazens, came here, and those 2 brothers lived here for 10 years. And so one long section of my book talks about their story. I was piecing together materials that I found here, mostly actually Samuel Sewall's diaries. Sewall wrote about them. But then bits and pieces from congregational records from the Jewish congregation in London, Bevis Marks, which I'll show you a picture of a little bit later. The Frazens brothers were part of this Portuguese Jewish family that had branches on both sides of the Atlantic. And for whatever reasons, they decided to sojourn here in Boston for 10 years to manage their transatlantic shipping. We don't know very much about their interactions with local people, except for a few little stories that we pick up. One of them, which is more funny than really indicative of anything important, but it's too amusing to not tell, is that in 1699, an alleged accomplice of Captain Kidd was brought here to Boston and put on trial. And the story went that this guy if they had the right guy, if they had apprehended the right guy, they would know they had the right guy because according to what they knew about this accomplice, he had been kidnapped and forcibly circumcised in North Africa by some Muslim, Barbary pirates. And so the Puritan authorities wanted to check to see if they had the right guy, but they didn't know how they would be able to tell whether this was a real circumcision. And who would be able to tell them? Well, apparently they sent for one of the Frazens brothers and brought him in to check, and Samuel Frazens produced an affidavit, which I looked at in writing this book, saying, yes, this man was circumcised, but not according to the practice of the Jews. He made some fairly disparaging remark about how the Muslims don't circumcise as well as cleanly as we do. Again, you don't hear very much more about these Frazens brothers, except that Samuel Sewall and Cotton Mather both wrote about them, and that's where my story picks up. Now, I'm sure you know about Samuel Sewall, the magistrate. I like to tell people when I'm discussing him in connection with this book that one of the most important aspects of his Jewish profile is that he once owned all of Brookline. So that gives him some Jewish bona fides right there. But he had a genuine fascination with Judaism, and he wrote about it in several different manuscripts and pamphlets, some of which I looked at here. At one point, when he made a trip back to England in the 1680s, which he writes about in his diary, he went out of his way to go to, so maybe now I can find some more images here to show you. There's Sewall, and while he was in England, he made a trip to this place. This is Bevis Marks. This is the oldest synagogue in England, built in 1701 on the east end of London. And he wrote about going to services here, and then he also went to this place, which is adjacent to Bevis Marks. This is the Mile End Jewish Burial Ground, also in the east end of London. If you want to know, there's a little fox running across the guy who sent me this photo thought I might like having the fox in there, and I do. I'm glad that there's a fox in there. In any case, one of the stories that Sewall tells about going to this cemetery was that he walked there from the synagogue, And while he was there, he reports on a conversation that he had with the groundskeeper, a Jewish man who was the groundskeeper. And they enjoyed one another's company. And then when it was time to part ways, the groundskeeper said, I hope we may meet in heaven. And Sewall said, yes, that would be nice to meet in heaven. And then the groundskeeper says to him, and we'll have a beer there, which is apparently what they were doing. They were having a beer. I can't quite picture where they were having a beer in the cemetery. But I thought it was remarkable that Sewall would mention that and not really comment disparagingly about the fact that this guy's idea of heaven was a place where you would have a beer with somebody. Sewall is an interesting person because he's deeply religiously committed. He's not a weak Calvinist by any means, but at the same time he's remarkably open, tolerant. I don't know. I think that's sort of that's an anachronistic word to use. But he seems to be non-judgmental, let's say, about the Jews that he writes about. That's one episode in which that occurs. He's much more famously known in this regard for having been the one Salem judge who apologized publicly for condemning the Salem witches. So he goes down in history and is honored in history for that as well. Now, I'm going to mention as well that the interaction that he has with the Frazens brothers involves him borrowing a Spanish Bible from them. And again, just says that I met with these two brothers, they Jewish brothers. They're both very well educated in Judaism, and one of them loaned me a Bible. And he leaves it at that. But then later on, he tells a story about somebody else that you've certainly heard about. This is Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather knew the Frazens brothers as well, except Samuel Sewall evinced no apparent eagerness to convert these Jews. He just seemed to be sort of fascinated by them. And for my part, I guess what I try to do in the book is to align Sewall with this more individualistic, pietistic strain of Puritanism, which is basically arguing that, it's not really our job to convert Jews. We hope that the Jews will be converted. It's very important that it should happen, but this is in God's hands. It's not something that we should be activists about. Cotton Mather is quite the opposite. And so Cotton Mather he finds out that these two Jewish men are in Boston, and he decides that it's going to be his job to convert them. And we know about it because both he and Sewall write about it. Mather, at one point in his diary, comments that there are these two Jewish brothers, and I would give everything I have in the world, and I would writhe in the dirt if I could just bring about the conversion of one Jew. And so what he decides to do is he sends a letter and a pamphlet. Mather wrote a couple conversion pamphlets that were, telling Jews that they were on the wrong path and so on. He sent one of these pamphlets to one of the Frazens brothers in hopes that this would change this guy's mind about the divinity of Christ. Sewall wrote about how this experiment failed because what happened was that besides sending the pamphlet, Mather then went to visit Mr. Frazen in his house, and according to Sewall, actually faked being in some kind of a trance. Mather did, and also apparently, again according to Sewall, forged some non-existent proof of some previous Jewish acquiescence to the divinity of Christ. He makes up a non-existent text from the Jewish Bible that would offer final proof that Jesus is the Savior. So this doesn't work. Sewall seems to be sort of overjoyed in the fact that it didn't work. I think maybe just in a sort of just in the spirit of rivalry, he kind of gets a chuckle out of that. But it comprises a chapter in my book because, again, what I'm trying to talk about here is how you have the one strain represented by Sewall, which is leaving everything to God, the aspect of the Puritan Pietism, and on the other hand, just as much a part of the Puritan theology, which argues that people have to do things in this world to bring about the New Jerusalem, which is Cotton Mather's position, and that includes doing everything in your power, including making up non-existent texts from the Bible, in order to bring the Jews to the light of Christ. Now, another episode that I talk about in the book, I have a chapter in the book about Judah Monis. And Judah Monis is a fascinating figure. He's among the different episodes in the book. This is the one that's been written about the most, but I'm not satisfied with any of the scholarship until mine, of course, about him. I don't think anybody's really figured out what to say about this guy until I have. But Monis' story itself is fascinating enough that if I had the inclination, if I were going to write a novel, let's say a historical novel, it would maybe be about him. Not that I'm going to do it, but he is born in Italy, also of Sephardic background, and for some reason that I haven't been able to tell from the archives I found either here, or I looked at materials at the American Jewish Historical Society in New York as well. There's nothing to indicate exactly why in his early 30s he left Europe and moved to New York initially. What we know about him, or at least what he claims, is that he was educated in what he calls the yeshiva in Amsterdam and also in Livorno or Leghorn in Italy, and we know that there were very important Jewish academies in those cities. So he claims status as an important Jewish scholar. And so that sort of, again, raises for me, well, then why does this important Jewish scholar decide to go to New York and open a hardware store in New York? But that's what he does. He arrives in New York in 1716 and has some brief affiliation with a fairly well-established Jewish congregation in New York called Sharith Israel. But apparently, retailing isn't his idea of a life's pursuit, and he's so devoted to scholarship and particularly to Hebraic scholarship that he contrives another plan. And this plan is he has enough awareness to know that there's a college in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called Harvard, and at that college, all undergraduates are required to study Hebrew. And here's this guy who knows Hebrew very well, learned Hebrew at the Jewish academies, the most important Jewish academies of Europe, and so he sends letters, a sequence of letters to Increase Mather and other authorities at Harvard saying, look, I've written this grammar of the Hebrew tongue, and you can have it, and you can have me if you're so inclined. So the Mathers bring him to Harvard, and what you're looking at here is the frontispiece for the Hebrew grammar that he prepared and that a couple decades worth of Harvard students had to slog through in their study of Hebrew. Before the book had been published, there was some difficulty in publishing the book because the Hebrew lettering had to be imported from England, and it took some time to get the print material from there. So in the interim, for about 15 years or so, every student who took Monis's class had to hand copy this book in its entirety. What you're looking at here is in the archives here. It's a notebook that's about 200 or so pages long. The extant copies of this thing, many of them include a bunch of doodlings, and there's one that quite famously insults Monis in the margin, just like I imagine my students probably do in Fitchburg in their textbooks. In any case, Monis is brought to Cambridge, but I'm sure that you can imagine that there's a little bit of a catch here. He is offered a position at Harvard in exchange for something very important and noteworthy, and that is that he must convert to Christianity. And he does, quite willingly does, and then is afforded a pretty lengthy career at Harvard. He didn't retire there until 1760, so he taught there for 38 years. It doesn't seem to have been very delighted by Harvard. Most of the records we have, besides the notebook and that sort of thing, are whiny letters that he writes complaining that he's being underpaid and so on. I want to read just a little portion of the book where I talk about, because again, I try to put all of these episodes in context, and I'll just read you a little bit from my book about why I think this guy's story is important. It's the other historians with whom I've been dissatisfied, they're all asking the same question. And for me, it's sort of a silly question. The question is, did he really mean it when he converted to Christianity? Did he mean it in his heart? And then they scan the hardly existing evidence to say, yes, he was, or no, he wasn't. And it's just not a very satisfying, it seems like a sort of a dead end. So instead of doing that, what I do is I talk about, I have no idea whether he meant it or not. He seems to have meant it from what I've seen. But what's more important is how his conversion and how his career at Harvard, what light that sheds on, again, a crisis within sort of latter-day, mid-18th or early and mid-18th century New England Puritanism. The things that these people, the Mathers and so forth, the Puritan orthodoxy, what they were struggling with, and how Monis's arrival and career sort of offers some insight into that dilemma. So I'll read just a little bit about that from the book. His conversion took place at College Hall at Harvard in March 1722. It was a very, very large service that was held. And again, another piece that I used to develop this chapter was the conversion pamphlet, which itself comprises about 300 pages. It's got a wonderful title. It's called The Truth, The Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth. These are the three parts of this conversion pamphlet. Whether he himself wrote it or Increase Mather wrote it is difficult to know, but my guess is that based on the somewhat halting English that you see in those letters he wrote to Harvard, he probably had some assistance in preparing that pamphlet. In any case, this conversion ceremony and the pamphlet was distributed not only through New England, but in England as well. And it confirmed the same fixation with covenantal ties and gestures that baptism had symbolized. One of the things that Monis underwent as part of this conversion ceremony was a baptism. But the baptism, you see, that speaks to the sort of covenantal aspect of Puritanism. In other words, you go through this ceremony, it's equivalent to circumcision, you're following the law, you're a Christian. And that doesn't sit well with a lot of people, including pietistic Puritans who don't perhaps buy the idea that through just going through a ceremony, you automatically become a Christian. As the article in the New England Current indicated, and as the minutes from the First Church in Cambridge demonstrated, Puritans took great pride in the fact of Monis's origins as a Jew. Had he been any kind of previously Gentile convert, or a Christian by birth merely returning to the fold, Monis would not have engendered so much enthusiasm. He was, however, as Benjamin Colman put it in his preface to the Conversion Discourses, quote, a very valuable proselyte. And he would be so esteemed by the learned and pious in one profession or other of Christianity. This is still Colman. He is truly read and learned in the Jewish Kabbalah and rabbins, that is rabbis, a master and critic in Hebrew. He reads, speaks, writes, and interprets it with great readiness and accuracy, and is truly apt to teach. Monis's Judaic background was the central factor behind his having been so warmly, or at least excitedly, received. Both Benjamin Colman and Increase Mather, who, although his ill health had prevented him from attending the ceremony itself, had contributed his own preface to the published version of Monis's three discourses. And these two men both emphasized the convert's credentials as a scholar not only of the Hebrew language, but of Jewish law. However, Monis's conversion, for all of the momentary uplift it may have brought to Harvard, offered stark confirmation of the waning influence of an increasingly untenable founding belief in Calvinism. Conversion, not so much of Jews as of ordinary Christians, had long been the central focus for New England congregations. How important was a conversion pamphlet urging Jews to convert in a place like New England when there were all of 3 Jews here? These conversion pamphlets were written, I argue, they were written for other Christians to chasten them in their own backsliding of different forms of backsliding. The intrinsic lack of assurance that had once defined the Puritan journey toward confirmation in Christ could not be maintained without some gesture in the direction of a more covenantal religious practice that would help parishioners to sustain at least a distant hope of their ability to do something toward affecting their status with Christ. As far back as the founding of Massachusetts Bay, therefore, hebraism, this fascination with Jews, had supplied a means of furnishing this covenantal assurance. Monis represented an apotheosis of Puritan Hebraism, But just as covenantal strictures and guidelines had provoked what one historian calls a, quote, distinctive redraft of the Christian redemption in the form, in this case, of antinomianism, for instance, in the early 17th century, just as that had created its own crisis, Monis's 18th century embodiment of a covenantal and Judaic Christianity would inevitably strain belief and tenability. Monis's conversion bore great potential as the ultimate achievement of the Hebraic and covenantal aspect of Puritanism, but it stood instead as a reminder of how, by 1722 at least, Hebraism and covenantal idea of Christianity had run its course as a viable instrument for legitimizing the orthodoxy's increasingly tenuous hold on congregational practice. So in the book, I try to do something like that with every one of these episodes, to try to look at these interactions between, again, these Sephardic merchants or Sephardic scholars and Puritans as a way of looking more closely at what it tells us about some internal dilemma or crisis within Puritanism, including the long waning, or not the long, we don't talk about declension anymore with Puritanism, but the idea that the central authority of a particular church congregation can no longer be upheld. Now, I'll talk about one more episode from the book, and then I think we should move on to Q&A, and this gives me occasion to show you a couple more pictures. The third episode, the final episode I want to talk about from the book is something that takes place, you can almost say it takes place during 5 particular months during the year 1773. As you may imagine, a book about Jews in New England in the colonial era is going to have to talk about Newport. And so, in fact, I have a couple chapters of the book, the latter part of the book, talk about events and correspondences in Newport, Rhode Island, around the Jewish congregation there. One of the most fascinating, and I hesitate to use this phrase because it sounds so sentimental, but I'm sorry, I'm going to almost heartwarming episodes in this sort of strange ecumenicism is a relationship that develops in Newport between a visiting rabbi to Newport, somebody named Chaim Carle, and this man is of Sephardic background, born in the city of Sfat in Israel, what's now Israel. I think it was his grandparents who came to there from Spain or Portugal after in the course of the Inquisition. He's educated, as Monis was, educated in Amsterdam and several other Jewish academies in Europe. And then he's apparently such a dynamic speaker and fundraiser that the Jews of Palestine, the Jews of his city, Sfat, send him on 2 world tours to try to raise money for this tiny, tiny Jewish congregation in Palestine. And so on one of these, the second of these trips that he sent across the Atlantic, he ends up spending 5 months in Newport, Rhode Island, where as of the late 1750s, early 1760s, there was an established, a quite well-established Jewish congregation in Newport. Jews were in Newport going back to the late 17th century. That's another story. But the actual congregation that met in an existing synagogue, that didn't really take shape until the mid-18th century. So Carle goes there. He's one of 6 visiting rabbis who spend some time there, and he's there from March to July 1773. Now, while he's there, he makes the acquaintance of this person. This is Ezra Stiles, who later went on to become the president of Yale. The portraits, by the way, are by the same artist. That's why they look so similar, but I'll talk about that in a minute. And Stiles, because he had gone to Yale and not to Harvard, he had not been forced to learn Hebrew as an undergraduate. So he decided a little bit later in his career, when he's the minister of one of the congregational churches in Newport, that it's time that he learns the Holy Tongue. And he is resourceful enough to know that the easiest, the most expedient way to learn this language is to walk literally, I think, 2 blocks from the church to what's now the Touro Synagogue, where there are a bunch of Jews who could teach him the language. And now the synagogue did not have a rabbi. There was no rabbi. There was no trained rabbi in what's now the United States until the mid-19th century. But they had a reader, a chazan, and this person's name was Isaac Turo. And Isaac Turo agreed to do Hebrew lessons with Ezra Stiles. And this begins in the 1760s. We know about all of this because, as you may also know, Stiles was a very ardent diary keeper, and he wrote a lot about everything he did, and he wrote a great deal about Jews. In fact, there's a book that I found in the stacks here called Ezra Stiles and the Jews, and it consists of about 100 pages from his diaries, just the pages where he talks about Jews. So he was one in the sequence of Puritan ministers who were fascinated by Jews and Judaism. He is making progress in learning Hebrew, but he's not really enthralled with any of these visiting rabbis until Carle arrives. And then somehow these two strike up a friendship. It's difficult to tell. It seems as though the level of Carle's scholarship was higher than that of these other rabbis. But my take on the whole thing, just from looking at Stiles' diary and also at the letters that these two men exchanged during the time in Newport and then after Carle left, these texts suggest that there was, I don't know what to call it except for a mutual admiration and friendship that in a sense, as I try to argue in the book, sort of transcended religious difference and inadvertently created a very open and, again, ecumenical relationship between these two men. I think Stiles himself, from what we know about him, was not surprisingly conflicted in various ways, conflicted about Calvinism, conflicted about other aspects of the religion that he was wholeheartedly devoted to but still had questions about. And in his attempt to alleviate these conflicts and to sort through them, he decided to do a very sensible thing, which was to read more and more scholarship, read more about Jewish history, try to find the oldest Hebrew texts that he could find, talk to Jews. He even talked to a Catholic. He writes about in his diary that one of the passages in the book about Ezra Stiles and the Jews, he makes passing reference to having talked to a Catholic one day as well. It's not as though he was he was not relinquishing his devotion to his very strong Protestantism, but he seemed to have been, again, somehow open for his own reasons, for his own purposes, to learning more about the precursor of Christianity, which was Judaism. And the friendship that he develops with Carle is just a fascinating case in point. The portraits are important to this story because Stiles commissioned both of them. He commissioned one of himself. The painter is somebody named Samuel King, who was sort of an amateur portraitist in Newport. Stiles commissioned this one, I think it's in the 1758 or 1760, something like that. And in his diary, Stiles talks about not just his face as rendered in the portrait, but every item that you see. So, for instance, these books on the shelf. If you look at Stiles' diary, he will tell you what each title is and why it's there, why this book is next to that book, and why this book is on the bottom shelf, and so on. Several of these texts are Hebrew texts, by the way. He also discusses this. Now, this little thing here you see is the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, in Hebrew lettering, and he explains this very odd looking, I don't know exactly what to call it, these things that, I won't even tell you what I think they look like, but they're souls being drawn to the light of divinity, something like that. He has this very detailed apparatus in his diary that explains every minor detail here, and what I argue in the book is that he was so wrought up about his own spiritual path that he felt it necessary to be extremely introspective, even introspective in the portrait that he sat for, in trying to determine his own faith, the basis of his faith, the complex theology, what he believed, what he didn't believe, what its precedents were, and so on. And what I argue in the book is that this created a lot of difficulty for him, just spiritually, mentally, and his relationship with Carle was a way of sort of alleviating this, of escaping from it, because he could talk to Chaim Carle, and Carle had this very, at least as Stiles experienced it, a very elemental connection to Hebrew precedent. Carle knew the Bible not just from reading the Bible, but from living in the land of the Bible. And Stiles asked Carle questions about the land of the Bible. So this portrait here, which Stiles commissioned after Carle had died, what I talk about in the book here is that you see a total absence of any sort of apparatus. There are no books on a shelf. There are no, the only caption, which you can't really see very well here, it just has his name and his year of birth and the year of his death, and that's it. This very plain portrait almost is Stiles' statement of something that he wished he had in his own theology. He wished he had just a very simple face to show the world, but his theology was so complicated by all kinds of internal dilemmas. Now, whether Carle was as unconflicted as he's shown in this painting, of course, we don't know. This is Ezra Stiles' projection as instructed to the painter of what to make. But in any case, that's why these portraits are important for my analysis. Thank you very much.